AI is everything. It's going to save the world and it's going to destroy the world. It's going to solve the climate crisis and it's going to cause more of it to happen. It's going to transform healthcare and it's going to drive digital exclusion. It's going to ruin elections and it's going to solve the disinformation problem. It's going to transform your business for the better and it's going to cost you a load of money and it's going to fail. What is the right answer to the AI question? Where should we be placing our chips? We know we have to invest in it if we're running businesses. We know we have to. It's basically the law. If you're not doing that, it means you're falling behind. That's probably true, but what are you investing in and what kind of outcomes are you expecting to get? There's one person better placed than most to start to answer that question. He's good at answering questions. He's been doing it for decades. His name is Anthony Scriffignano, and he's a data scientist. But he's not an ordinary data scientist. He's kind of the guru of data scientists. He's been working as chief data scientist at Dun Bradstreet for more than 20 years, until very recently. He stepped back from that slightly. He's still very much involved, but he's now also a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. They are really interested in using brains like his and a lot of data to solve some of the biggest challenges in the world. So what is the right question? Where is AI going and what does it mean to you? Let's see what Anthony has to say. Anthony, welcome to the podcast. Thanks very much for joining us and bringing with you your vast intellect and knowledge in our chosen subject today, which is, of course, AI and how on earth we're supposed to use it properly and what people should actually be doing with it. But before we get onto any of that, let us know a bit more about yourself. I know a bit of the background and it's kind of impressive and intimidating, but maybe you could give me your view. Well,
intimidation usually starts from illusion, but I will tell you, I've had a rather long career as what we would now call a data scientist. It wasn't called that back in the day. I've been working with computer and information sciences for over 40 years. I've had various positions, management consulting in the Big Four, worked with some of the very large corporations in financial services, chemical industry, manufacturing. Most recently, for just over 20 years, closing in on 21 years, I retired as the chief data scientist at Dun Bradstreet, which is a storage company, one of the oldest businesses in the United States, and was the primary inventor on a lot of their intellectual property relating to identity resolution, veracity adjudication, geospatial inference, multilingual semantic disambiguation, which is great if you're having trouble sleeping. I can talk about that.
Just trying to say that actually over a few times is going to
all kinds of things. And then now I am with the Stimson Center, which is a Washington, D.C. think tank, very well regarded, and I certainly regard them very highly. I'm with the Alfred Lee Loomis Innovation Council there. And my background is a sort of a smattering of physics and computer science, a lot of AI, a lot of algorithms, advanced algorithms. So I'm kind of the nerdy nerd that loves a new algorithm once in a while.
Who doesn't? Right. So you know a thing or two about bits and bytes and how they might be stitched together to do very clever things. And obviously in the last couple of years, we've had the emergence, the public unveiling of AI and generative AI in particular. And there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of people doing all sorts of different things with it. But where do you stand on it? How would you characterize where we're at right now in terms of in all of this? How does someone who knows what they're talking about puncture the zeitgeist of noisy chaos to actually tell us what's AI all about, what's going on?
I may say something that you don't expect, but I don't care as much about the tool until I understand what we're trying to build with it. So I always try to lead with the question, the business problem, the risk, the opportunity, the how will we know when we're done moment, right? AI may be the answer. And so many things are being called AI these days. There's an AI toothbrush out there. I'm not quite sure what that does for me.
Right, I'm going to need to
Yeah.
look that one up.
You can call almost anything that does any kind of computation AI these days, and no one will argue with you. It was kind of like when the big data explosion happened. Anything with data in it all of a sudden was big data because it somehow was important to say big data 7 or 8 times a day to everyone. And now you're not allowed to say that anymore. So
Yeah.
AI is kind of like that. It's not really a new thing. I think we all kind of know somewhere in the back of our minds it's been around for a very long time, 1950s. But it's only recently that there's enough data and enough compute power to do some of the things that were theoretically possible or practically possible, but with high performance computing and massive amounts of storage and spending crazy money. And now there's an API for that. So it has become more democratized, and it has certainly become more in the news. Generative AI is something we need to pay attention to, and not just say Gen AI. And I'm not accusing you of that, but there's lots of people running around now, probably some of the same ones that were running around saying big data, waving their hands and saying Gen AI as often as they can. Generative AI, loosely defined, is AI that generates content. It doesn't just consume content, curate content, evaluate content. It actually generates content. And the reason we need to pay attention to that, people of the human race, is because now our data sphere contains data that was created by algorithms designed to mimic, in very many cases, the behavior of humans doing something that humans do. And so how do we know if those words you read were written by a human or written by an algorithm pretending to be a human? And of course, how do you know if those images that you're seeing that appear to contain things that humans are interested in actually ever existed in the real world? Those are really important questions. And we are, in my opinion, not paying enough attention to those questions as we are all excited about, what can we do with the next Gen AI in our products? How do we monetize this? How do we get it out there? You got to be very careful.
Yeah. There is a lot of action and not a lot of pausing to
There's
think.
a lot of
right?
ready, fire, aim.
Yeah, exactly, and especially perhaps where this is being deployed in sensitive areas, where we're actually saying, look, let's use this in our banking institutions, let's use this in our public sector and our healthcare systems, and what can we do with AI to distribute welfare more quickly, and let's let some of that happen because of decision making that might be happening not by humans anymore, because my God, it's so much quicker. And then over time, you might end up in a place where you realise that some of these decisions are being based on data that actually had nothing to do with humans in the first place. And so,
maybe we should be careful. I'm not saying we shouldn't use it in banking or healthcare or anywhere else. I'm saying we should use it on purpose, and I'm saying that we should be careful that we understand what it's doing. But it may be that in terms of banking, to understand fraud, for example, or in terms of healthcare, to do things like drug discovery, maybe we could use a little help. So it's not a bad idea to use. AI is not something bad that needs to be stamped out. We just need to understand when we use it, what we're doing with it.
Would you say, this might be slightly twee as a comment, but would you say that the unveiling of AI via things like ChatGPT, and making it so unbelievably universally accessible to everybody, 99.9% of whom have got no idea what it's actually doing, might be part of the problem? It's sort of short-circuited things a little bit.
Well, certainly it has caused us to rethink almost everything that involves at least words right now, and certainly images, but words for sure. Maybe an example in academia. If I use, and I don't want to necessarily say ChatGPT, there's lots of tools, but if I use generative AI to generate some words, and then I cut and paste them and say, here's my words, teacher. I think we all feel like that's some form of, I won't call it plagiarism, but it's some form of something that we don't have a word for yet. You can argue that you created the prompt that generated those words, and how is that any different than if you use text to speech, and on and on and on. And these arguments are painful. You know what you did. And without thinking about it, you know what you did. Now, on the flip side of that, to get ready for a conversation like this, if I go into some tool and I say, what are the latest evolutions in regulations around AI? And I wouldn't phrase it like that, but imagine I said something like that. And then I look at the answer and I compare it to kind of what I know, and I see if there's anything net new that it told me. I don't have time to read all the articles that came out yesterday all over the world in every language. So, yeah, help me. But I'm going to still use my human brain to reduce that. I don't feel bad about that at all. So somewhere in between those two, you know what you did, and I don't feel bad about that at all, is where we need to try to be. And as long as we're where we are on purpose and we understand it, that's half the battle.
Yeah. So last time we spoke, we didn't spend too long paddling in the trivial, which is people cheating on their high school homework, but rather maybe thinking about bigger picture stuff, which is we've got incredibly powerful tools now that potentially could be solving some very, very important problems if we have the data that we need to do that. So maybe you could expand on that kind of idea a little bit, which is we were talking about things like managing disruption, predicting scenarios in a sensible way that actually help us to improve humanity and its conditions, and all big stuff. How would you expand on some of that?
Okay, let me unpack that a little bit. First of all, a little trip down memory lane. A lot of the AI that we experienced in understanding things like disruption was what's called supervised AI. So give me a whole bunch of data about the past, and I will consume it and I will regress around it. And as long as that data is big enough and represents what they call all the modes, all of the different lumpiness of the behavior that I'm trying to understand, then I will build sort of a predicting machine that will help me predict what's going to happen. And then I will test it on the past. And when it gets past a certain amount of, a certain level of precision, I'm trying not to say accuracy because painful conversation. But most people would say accuracy there. Let's use it, right? And it'll probably be good for the future because at least the near future looks like the recent past. And if all of the ifs that statistics tells us are there, so the data has to be stable. We have to understand random cause and assignable cause variation, all of those things that we all learned in school and then promptly forget because, well, if there's enough data, it's probably okay. It'll probably be okay. And it does tend to work fairly well when things are stable. When things start to become disrupted, when they start to not look like the past, all of a sudden, those things don't work very well. And that's okay. So think about the insurance industry. They look at things like loss ratios. How many claims have we had for a certain type of event, right? And if we look at 100 years of history, and then we really focus in on your last 5 years of history to figure out how much to charge you, that works really well. But it doesn't work really well when all of a sudden there's a war, or when all of a sudden COVID happens, or when all of a sudden something that we didn't have in our longitudinal data that's big and disruptive happens. It's very difficult for those types of math to work. And what comes into play is the elasticity, that you had enough degrees of freedom that you're still probably okay because you kind of fluffed it, right? Well, what happens with disruption, though, when the response to the disruption is disrupted? So in the middle of COVID, when we were turning off all the airplanes and shutting off all the small business and not traveling across borders and trying to figure out vaccines, and all the vaccines are different, and some are mRNA and some are adenovirus, and all this epidemiological stuff going on. There's a ship stuck in the middle of the Suez Canal. And so that produces all kinds of disruption in supply chains, and it caused problems on the west coast of the United States with intermodal shipping. Like, what? In the middle of trying to respond to the prior disruption. So that disruption is horrifically difficult to deal with supervised methods because you don't have data to train on. The biggest danger you can find yourself in is when the environment that you're working in is changing faster than the data that describes it. There's no AI button to press to be able to deal with something like that. People will take issue with me saying that. There are certain methods that will sort of take one step, calculate really fast, take another step, update conditional probabilities. That's how we deal with hurricanes and things like that. So you can use those methods, but with this kind of disruption at this epic scale where it's historically unprecedented and the data isn't well represented, no, sorry, that doesn't work. You need to use a much more complex approach to something like that.
Right. So how might, therefore, we be looking at AI to start to help us with these things? Presumably, it doesn't really start with AI. It starts with what kind of data have we got and how fast can we get it? And how
I think it actually starts before that with something they call problem formulation, like ask a good question, right? If you just start collecting data, you may or may not be collecting data, right?
Oh, true.
I'll use an example that is top of mind to a lot of folks right now. There's a lot of nation-state things going on in the world. And without getting into any one of them in particular, we've got election cycles, we've got military actions, we've got threats of military actions, and then we've got benign things, or at least hard to understand things. Why are all these probes going to the moon all of a sudden? Okay, so there's a lot of stuff. And then there's a lot of people talking about that stuff. And they're saying lots of words, and those words are getting consumed by this AI, right? Suppose I ask a question, reasonably well-formed, like, to what extent can we meaningfully discover individuals who are likely producing disinformation? So disinformation is intentionally saying something wrong to produce some sort of adversarial manipulation, as opposed to misinformation, which is you hear me say it, it sounds true, and you repeat it. You didn't actually make up the lie, or the, we don't call them lies for legal reasons. You didn't make it up, but you heard me say it, and I used a lot of fancy words, so you like it and you repeat it, right? That's misinformation. But my question was, to what extent can we likely discover individuals that are more likely than others to be the progenitors of disinformation? It's a really interesting question. And I would then start to collect lots and lots and lots of information where people are talking about the topic of interest, where people are talking in general, where people are not talking about the topic of interest. And then I would create a methodology to convolute around that data and look for coalescent behaviors that are consistent with disinformation. I would then compare it to a heuristic frame, a bunch of experts that know stuff, and I would try to get the AI to work at least as well as those experts. So it wouldn't be perfect, but it would be another expert that could sit alongside you and help you with this almost impossible task. And you can see the way I told that story. That's a very doable thing. Can you do it perfectly? Absolutely not.
Good.
There's all kinds of reasons why that's hard. The biggest reason why that's hard is something called observer effects, where human beings, if they think they're being watched and they're doing something that they don't want you to see, they change their behavior. So if you just model how the best ones are no longer behaving, right? The Lex Luthor factor. There's going to be an element of that, but, I can sort of work that into my methodology as well. But I would start with, to what extent can we meaningfully? In other words, I leave open the possibility that, no, I can't do it. I don't start with, don't worry, boss, I'm going to do it and we're going to monetize it tomorrow, right? I start with a properly approached question, which is this doable? Can we do it as well as those people over there? How would we measure it? How would we know if we were doing it well? That's called science, as opposed to collect a bunch of data, push the button, hope it works.
Right. And if we can start with the right questions, those questions are what can lead us to start to look at some really serious problems.
Absolutely. And please help me, Gen AI, right? Like, or any AI. It doesn't have to be generative AI. Like, please help me. I'm not saying go away, AI, you're not welcome here. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that when I go into the hardware store, I don't start by buying tools. I think about what the project is.
Yeah, absolutely. So last time we spoke, you said another interesting thing as well, which was a good way of looking at AI right now. Its capacity, potentially, or the capacity of people who are using AI is not quite fully formed yet. We're at the beginning of a journey where AI is the machine equivalent of a acne-ridden, squeaky-voiced adolescent who's convinced that perhaps he knows everything, but in reality knows very little, and there's going to be a lot of mistakes made as part of gaining experience and knowledge in order to start doing things a bit more cleverly. But that analogy, how would you paint that analogy? Since it was,
I may have said it less elegantly, but yeah, AI is a teenager. It's a teenager right now. It can drive, it can go out and do things on its own, but it doesn't always do what we asked it to do. It doesn't always do what it should do. Sometimes it gets high or drunk. It can hallucinate. It can lie. It doesn't always take all the advice it's given or listen to all the things that it could have heard, right? So it's a good analogy for thinking about AI right now. That doesn't mean, don't give the teenager the keys to the car, but it means be careful and know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and think about, just like you would with giving the keys to the car to the teenager, what reasonable controls might you put in place to make sure that it's doing what you hope it will do and still growing up on its own.
Yeah. So with that in mind, and with everything else we've talked about in mind, AI is a mysterious and interesting beast. It's powerful. It's also not particularly helpful. It depends what questions you're asking. If you were, if rather than being just some random guy on a podcast, I was actually someone important running a very big organization, and I was thinking about what is this AI thing? What should I be doing with it? What questions should I be asking the rest of my team about this stuff? What would you say to them?
Well, I may be just some other random guy on a podcast, but I have a frame that I think might be helpful to think about this. If you think about first the known met needs, the things you already do to serve your customers, your employees, your shareholders, whoever you're serving, right? The known met needs are the things you do today. And AI might help you do those things faster, better, cheaper, so forth. So that's where some of the early use cases come in. Can we use AI to build a chat bot so we don't have to have so many people answering the phones and all those kinds of things? Those are addressing known met needs in a more efficient way. The known unmet needs are the things that you can't do today, either because it would take you too long. It's the opposite of faster, better, cheaper, right? It would take you too long, or you don't really know how to do it, or it's too expensive or something like that. So you might address some of those known unmet needs, those things that your customers, shareholders, employees, whoever you're serving are asking for. I couldn't do it for you yesterday, but I can do it for you today, right? There's two other categories if you permeate this, right? The unknown met needs are where you can get into a lot of trouble. So there are ways that the world, let me just talk about serving customers because it's hard to do it in all three of those frames. There are ways that you're serving your customers today that you're not aware of, but you're doing it anyway. So people may be using your platform that you think was a game platform, and they're using the chat function to talk to each other while they're playing games. Now, you change the chat function, and because you think it's being used one way, and they're actually using it in a completely different way, and all of a sudden they're all upset. And they don't always tell you why. They just run away, right? And they go use some other product, right? So you have to be very careful that you take pains to uncover those unknown met needs, right? That last box is the unknown unmet need. And this is the box that, well, everybody says, well, if it's unknown, how can you do anything about it? Well, you take pains to say, what am I forgetting? What am I not thinking about? What have I forgotten? What, does AI present any opportunities for me that I didn't even articulate before because I didn't know about AI, right? This is where things like when the iPad came out, I was standing in line at a conference, and there was some people standing behind me. We were all waiting to check in, and one guy says to the other guy, "Did you get the new iPad?" And the guy says, "Yeah, I got it." He said, "How do you like it?" And the guy said, "Well, it's very interesting. I still carry a pad. I'm not quite sure why this is good for me yet." So, you don't want to do, I mean, you can make a lot of money doing that if it's attractive enough, but, you probably want to think a little bit. When COVID happened, I keep using COVID because it gave us so many lessons. There were a lot of medical things that happened pretty quickly and amazingly and heroically because there was this unknown, unmet need that all of a sudden became known. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Well, let's focus on this. Let's focus on that. And in the middle of that, there were companies that used to make scuba gear that were looking into how to make respirators. And there were companies that used to make blankets that were looking at making face masks. So, that unknown, unmet need can be a great teacher if you're paying attention.
Right. And so that's what leaders with money burning a hole in their pockets, waiting to be spent on the next shiny piece of AI jewelry. That's what they should be thinking about. Is let's examine our needs, whether unmet or met, or known or unknown.
I mean, that's one way.
And then we can think if AI is the actual answer.
So you lead with the problem. You lead with the opportunity. You lead with the risk. Don't lead with the, how can we? It's fine if you want to spend a little bit of money like playing. But I have not yet seen, and you have to think about the industries I've worked in. In some cases, it can be very effective. Just get a bunch of smart people, throw them in a room, give them lots of technology, and see what comes out. And there are places where that works. But in general, it's a bunch of people that think they're cool playing with stuff, and, it's an accident sometimes if something comes out of that. If you give them a question or you give them a problem or you give them a contest or you give them an incentive, watch how the behavior changes.
Yeah. I seem to remember you giving me quite a good example of this. I think it was from a piece of your past at Dun Bradstreet where to illustrate the importance of asking the right question. I'm not sure if that's something you can talk about or not, but
I'll do that publicly, so I think it's okay. This is the China thing. Somebody came to me under a lot of pressure for time, and they said, I really need to know how many businesses there will be in China in 5 years. And I'm leaving out all the hyperbole that surrounded this communication. Good guy. And they had like 2 hours. And what he wanted to do was just draw a straight line through the graph of, how many there were last year and the year before. And I said, please don't do that. That's a really bad idea. And he said, yeah, everybody keeps telling me that. I don't know, it's a math thing, whatever, but I need an answer because I have to put it in this document. So I said, okay, I have to, do some work here. I have to estimate organic growth, organic decay, our willingness to invest, certain political things. What are you going to do with the answer? And he said, well, there's this customer that wants the answer. It's part of my response to something, and I don't really know. And I said, all right, well, I'll do all those things I just said to the best of my ability if you promise I can talk to this guy next week when you're out of your time crunch. He said, sure, he's a great guy. So we get on the phone, and I said, I'm the guy that told you how many businesses there's going to be. I don't know the answer to that, and nobody else does either, right? And he said, I know that, of course. That's why I asked you, so I can sort of quote you, and I don't have to worry about it. And I said, well, what's your... Why? What are you doing with the answer? And it turns out his boss is asking him, and he was asking him in the context of ocean going freight. So I said, well, so you don't really care about restaurants and banks and consulting companies in this question. You really care about companies that make things and ship things by ocean freight. And he said, well, yeah. And then there was an element of sales to this. And I said, well, you probably also care about the your existing customers and non-customers, because your penetration rates will be different. And he said, well, yeah. And I said, so what you really want is a 4-factor analysis in and out of the industry and in and out of your customer base projected for 4 years or 5 years. And he said, he paused and he said, well, yeah, that's what I asked you for, right? And of course it wasn't. But, he was very happy once we got through all of that, and I did it for him. The bottom line is that, sometimes the answer to hurry up, I need this, is I have 3 questions first. And you can be really annoying with that. And sometimes, if the building is on fire, don't say I have 3 questions first. Like, go that way, right? But rarely are we in a situation where you can't stop and just take a breath and say, what's going on here? What's the question? What are we trying to solve? And if you do that, you could save yourself a tremendous amount of wasted resource. And also, there's an opportunity cost in these days. This industry is moving so fast, and these tools are getting better so much faster. And there's so much more data tomorrow than there will be yesterday, and all that you don't just go back and do it over. You've lost. You fall behind faster when you take a wrong step. So it's really important to take a little time. And maybe, you can always do instead of ready, fire, aim, it could be ready. Some of you start firing, and, the rest of us, you can sort of, it's not a binary kind of thing.
Yeah. So I think what I'm taking from our conversation so far is that actually there's a veil of chaos around AI. No one really knows what it's going to do to help anyone in any particular set of specific circumstances. So there are ways that you can try to start experimenting with it, but actually what more people need to do is just ask them they need to ask the right question, and that is, well, hang on, let's identify the problems first, because it turns out actually there might be a guy in the corner who already knows the answer to that before we even begin going down this journey. But let's figure out what the problems are first, and then ask questions about the technology. But in that context, I wonder what it feels to me, and I'm obviously far less of an expert in this thing, that there's an added reason to be cautious and quite specific about what you think you might want to do with AI. And that is because in the future, AI as a technology is potentially going to become a very expensive thing indeed. And that's because, and I might be wrong, tell me if I'm wrong, the data that just storing data is becoming more and more difficult to do. It's the amount of data that's just being produced continuously by us all. It's like on an exponential curve. We think of it as going into the cloud, which is fine because that is an amorphous, ill-defined bunch of gas in the air, right? It's not hardware, but of course it is hardware. It's just somebody else has built it.
Somebody else's hardware, you don't know where it is, but it...
Right, but it's still expensive and hard. There's scarcity kind of baked into the whole thing. But now you've got and obviously the more scarce something is, the more expensive it's going to be to access it and use it. But now we're piling layers of AI on top, which is itself generating new data. There's presumably a challenge here, which says when in the business of rushing at this stuff, using it in order to try and find the question that we want to ask, maybe it would be kind of prudent to say, actually, we really need to be really careful about these resources and spend a lot more time and a lot more caution thinking about what we're going to do with them first, because we might find ourselves in rather expensive traps. That was a really long-winded way of saying, isn't there a kind of tipping point here where we start to realize that we can't be experimental with this as much? It's not a playground. It's actually an extremely expensive thing that we're... Does that make sense?
You said a lot of things there, all of which made sense.
Sorry, it was a jumble.
Try to react a little bit. First of all, it is very expensive. If you want to do any kind of hardware, any kind of AI at scale, serving your customers, it's not like you just get an API and call it a day. Like there's a lot that has to be done to responsibly implement AI. And you also have to think about the regulatory framework that you're in. There's pretty much all over the world. There's dozens of countries that already have AI regulation. There's many more that are thinking about it or impaneling, groups of experts to advise the regulators on it. So if you think about where we were with privacy not too long ago, this will make that look easy in terms of what's going on, in terms of trying to comply. There's headwinds and tailwinds here. Your customers will demand it. They don't care how expensive it is, and they don't really care how hard it is. You're going to have to explain why you're not using it at some point as well. And quite honestly, you might be called into question if you made a decision that was dramatically different than what AI might have recommended, because the AI could explain it at some level and you can't, that kind of thing. So, this isn't, unfortunately, this is what they call a red queen problem. Red queen problems are, it's a term for, in Alice in Wonderland, Alice says to the Red Queen at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, this is a strange place. I'm running as fast as I can and I don't seem to be getting anywhere. And the Red Queen says, well, it's the kind of place it is. You have to run as fast as you can just to stay where you are, right? So the problem with Red Queen problems is that you can't just do more of what you're doing today faster and make progress, but you also can't stop doing it. The solutions to these types of problems tends to be to do something orthogonal to what you're doing while continuing to do what you're doing, which, that run fast, slower. How do you do that? It's great. It's very hard to do. So I'm giving you a very long-winded answer to a very long-winded question, but I think
we're both very good at being long-winded.
I think what you have to do here is, first of all, you have to have a plan. You have to really know what you're doing. You can't wing it. Cost is certainly a consideration. Regulatory constraint is certainly a consideration. Do you have the right people? You mentioned data a lot. Do we have the right data? Is it growing at a rate that is consistent with the thing that we want to study? Is it growing? If it's growing hypergeometrically, the rate of change is also changing, which is kind of what's happening. Is there a way we can reduce it? Can we address the discovery and curation and synthesis of that data in a way that is credible? You talk about cloud computing. So cloud computing is a synonym for other people's data centers, right? It's data that you put somewhere else, and there's reasons why that's a good thing from a security standpoint, especially if you're a smaller enterprise. Presumably, they can pay more to protect your data than you could, and they're better at it. That's great. It's more ubiquitous and discoverable. That's great. But sometimes AI wants all the data to be in one place in order to be able to convolute around it to do certain things. Well, you kind of just said it wasn't all in one place. So, how are you going to deal with that? There's a reason why we hire experts to do things that are complicated. The practitioners that work in this field in the future are going to be more like the medical practitioners of today. The systems will be so complex that they can't understand them in their entirety. They'll have to make some sort of a differential diagnosis and plan some sort of intervention according to best practice, test the result, and keep going. That's where we're going with this. It's not going to be, where you can open up a book and say, well, this sorting algorithm has a lower complexity than that sorting algorithm, so it'll run faster. It's not like that. We're going to need a bunch of experts convening on things to get complex things done. That's okay. It's the way we do things now. We just don't do it with AI yet.
Yeah. Well, I suppose we need to start training these people then.
Yeah, that's another problem. What do you teach people, younger folks today, that will be relevant 3 years from now when they get out of school at the pace of change? That's a very real question that educators all over the world are facing right now. And in some countries in the world, they've said, well, there's a mandate that AI be part of the curriculum. Well, that's great. But remember when I said we haven't really well-defined AI, right? That's a start. It focuses everybody's attention for sure. When I think about AI literacy, I care less about whether you can do Python or R or pick a programming language. Okay, fine. If you're in marketing, can you do PowerPoint? Like, do we even ask that question? I'm going to assume that you either can do those things or you can learn those things. But I might ask you a question about when it's inappropriate to use supervised methodologies in the context of disruption. And if you look at me like I just spoke another language, we might have to have a conversation about that because you're dangerous.
It's dangerous. Well, I would have been very dangerous before this podcast, I should say. But the fact that you just brought it up now after explaining it is good. So I don't have to look at you like this. There's a lot to think about with this stuff, basically, and it's very early in the morning, I think, where you are, and so I'm not sure if this is a healthy way. Oh, is it? Okay. I just thought this is challenging and very big topics, and obviously you're sat right at the heart of it in what you do. I would hate to take even more of your time, so I'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much for joining us, and I really hope that you might join us again at some point in the future, because I bet this is going to be changing, and it will be changing.
Absolutely. I would be delighted to. It is a joy to speak with you. I love your intellectual curiosity. I love the fact that we can both be humble about this. This is a big problem.
I have to be. I've got no choice.
If I could offer maybe 3 pieces of advice to anyone that might be feeling confused, the first one would definitely be to be humble. You can't know all of this. You can't tackle all of this yourself. I don't care if you're a CIO or a EIEIO. You have to. You have to get help, and you have to make the circle bigger to make sure that you're asking the right questions and that you understand what you think you understand, because it's changing fast. And then the second thing I would say is something we've kind of emphasized in this conversation, which is seek first to understand. Make sure you understand what you're doing and why you're using that tool or that method or that environment. Don't just run and push the AI button because it's a teenager and it might do what you asked it to do, and that might be a very bad idea. And then
it might just draw on the walls and have a party.
And then the
leave.
Third thing is, I used to play water polo, and there's times where there's a fast break and you're swimming down the pool towards the other goal, and it's really important to once in a while pick your head up and make sure you're swimming in the direction you think you are, and that you don't get hit in the head by the ball that somebody passed to you, right? So when you have your question and you have your people and you've convened your experts and you know what to do, pick your head up once in a while, because there's disruption and maybe the environment changed, and maybe what was a really good idea when you started is not such a good idea anymore. So, keep assessing that environment and make sure that the relevancy of what you started is still relevant by the time you finish.
3 excellent pieces of advice. So, and a wonderful point to end this podcast on, I think. And the only problem we'll have is that we'll need to clip the end and put that out on its own, because that advice is kind of precious. And there's a worry, podcasts, a lot of people don't get to the end. So we'll do that. And make sure that everyone gets your pearls of wisdom.
I'm trying to get in there, so I hope that was...
No, that's superb. So excellent. Thank you very much for all of your time today, Anthony. And until next time.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you very much.